This screencast is going to focus on exam skills for the first section of the SY4 exam, which is on research methods. The SY4 exam is 2 hours in duration, and I recommend that you spend 50 minutes on the research method section, and that means about 10 minutes on the 10-mark question and the remaining 40 minutes on the 30 marker. So let's now look at examination technique for the 2 questions that you get on the research method section. Now what you can see on your screen at the moment is the layout of the research method section of the SY4 exam. So we can see that you'll be given a short bit of text to read, and this will be a very short summary of a piece of sociological research that has used a particular research method or style of research. And then you get a 10-mark question which is related to this item, and then you get this longer 30-mark question where you have to come up with a hypothetical research design. So the 10-mark question is always going to ask you to identify and briefly explain 2 reasons why the researcher described in the item chose to use a particular research method or style of research. Now, to make sure that you maximise your mark on this section, it's really important to read the item carefully. Okay, this isn't a question that is simply asking you to give 2 generic advantages of a particular research method. It's asking you why you think the researcher described in the item chose to use a particular approach. And the best way of laying out this question is to adopt a 2-paragraph approach. So in your first paragraph, identify 1 possible reason why the researcher chose to use a particular method, and then make sure that you develop and explain that reason in a bit more detail. Then leave a line and do the same for the second reason. Okay, what I'd like you to do in a moment is to hit the pause button and then read this item carefully, then read through the question, this 10-mark question, and then have a look at this sample answer. So hit the pause button, read the item, read the question, and then look at the answer, see what you make of this answer. Now hopefully what you've noticed is that though there's some good knowledge of semi-structured interviews in this answer, the answer is very generic. It is fallen into the trap of just writing about the general advantages of a particular method without relating it to the study that was described in the item. So out of 10 marks, this type of answer, even though it displays reasonably good knowledge of semi-structured interviews, would be unlikely to get more than 5 or 6 marks out of 10. Now this answer is probably a bit more difficult to read because this is what a candidate actually wrote in a real exam in answer to the same question. But if you hit the pause button and you try to read through this, what you should notice is that again there is good knowledge of semi-structured interviews, but it's much more related to the study that was given in the item. So we've got here reference to the topic that was being researched. We've got in this second paragraph a discussion of how this method helps the researcher deal with the sensitivity of the topic that was mentioned in the item. So this answer actually got 10 marks out of 10 because there are 2 relevant reasons why the researcher might have used semi-structured interviews, and crucially both of those reasons are really related to the topic of the research described in the item. Let's now move on to the 30-mark question. So I'm recommending about 10 minutes for the 10 marker because you only need to write 2 paragraphs, but you need to spend about 40 minutes on this 30-mark question, on this longer question. And this longer question is always going to start with the phrase, as an A-level sociology student, you've been asked to design a research project, And then the question will either instruct you to collect qualitative data, like we can see in this example, or alternatively, you might get the instruction that you've got to collect quantitative data. So it will be one or the other. Then they will give you a research topic, and you won't know this in advance, so this will be what you see when you turn over the exam paper. In this example, you're being asked to do attitudes towards the National Health Service amongst a sample of pregnant women in your area. So this is your target population. The rest of the question is standardized. So you're always going to be asked to outline each stage of your research design, explaining the reasons for your choices at each stage, and you're also always going to be asked to identify some of the problems that may occur and the impact on the quality of the data collected. So one of the things that you've got to get right on this 30 mark question is selecting what you think would be the most appropriate research method to gather the type of data that is required by the exam question. And my advice is that if you're asked to collect quantitative data, then you think about either using self-completion questionnaires, so these might be questionnaires that you hand out to people, or that you put through the post, or that you deliver via email, for example, or you use structured interviews. And a structured interview is simply a questionnaire that is read out to your respondent. So it's a questionnaire delivered as a face-to-face interview. You could use experiments for the collection of quantitative data, but to be honest, experiments are very much a minority method in sociology. They don't tend to get used very often. So I think it's safe for quantitative data to select either questionnaires or structured interviews. If, on the other hand, the question instructs you to collect qualitative data, then I would select either unstructured interviews or participant observation if you think that's more appropriate. I would advise strongly against using semi-structured interviews in your research design, and the reason for that is because semi-structured interviews combine some of the characteristics of both structured and unstructured interviews. You might get into a muddle when you're justifying and criticizing that method. It's easier to go for either structured interviews if you want quantitative data, or unstructured interviews if you need to collect qualitative data. The other thing that's really important with the 30 mark question is that you've got a really good understanding of what you think would be an appropriate sampling method. In examiner reports, the chief examiner has often criticised students for this section of their research design being a little bit vague. So make sure that you've got a really good knowledge and understanding of the main sampling techniques that sociologists use to help you answer this section of the exam. Now, this grid that you can see on the screen at the moment is the one that we've used in class to help you plan and structure effective answers to this 30 mark question. So this is very useful, I think, in making sure that you display the kind of knowledge and analysis that will get you a good mark on this section. So remember to operationalize any of the key terms that are used in the design brief, and this simply means defining any key concepts, or if you're doing quantitative research, talking about the indicators that you might use to help you measure a particular concept. Select what you think would be the most appropriate research method, and make sure that you spend at least a couple of paragraphs justifying that particular choice. Make sure that you always mention ethical issues. We talked about the importance of having good knowledge of sampling techniques. Talk about the importance of doing a pilot study first of all to iron out any problems that might exist with your research instrument. Talk about the practicalities of doing the research. So for example, if you're going to do interviews, where you're going to do those interviews, how you're going to record them, and so on. And then finally talk about the analysis of your results. When you're justifying your research design, it's really important to try to link your decisions to some aspect of Grover. And Grover, remember, is an easy way of remembering the methodological concepts that the examiner wants you to use in this section of the exam. So when you're talking about your method and the way in which you're going to do your research, always think about issues of generalizability and representativeness, and those issues will be particularly important when you're talking about sampling. Talk about objectivity, which is all about researcher bias. Talk about validity, which is about the truthfulness and accuracy of your research method. Talk about ethical issues, which we've mentioned, and also talk about reliability. You also need to look at the problems with your proposed research design, and again think about the impact that these problems might have on these issues that we call Grover. And when you're talking about the problems, the key things to focus on really are problems with your research method, ethical problems that might exist, and also problems with your sampling technique. Now, to some extent, you can rehearse a really good quantitative research design and a really good qualitative research design using that grid before you get into the exam. But you don't want to be over-rehearsed. The real trick in getting a high mark for this section of the exam is not to make your answer too generic. This is an extract from the examiner's report from last summer, where it says that once again examiners reported that there were a significantly high number of rehearsed generic research designs. And whilst the research decisions may demonstrate some accurate knowledge, if the decisions are not explained in the context of the design brief, they have limited value. So you really need to think about the purpose of the research and make sure that your research design is really closely linked to the purpose of the research. Let me try and make this important aspect of exam technique a little bit clearer by looking at a couple of examples. So here we've got a question, so we can see that in this case the instruction is to collect qualitative data, and the topic is attitudes towards healthcare, and the target population is a representative sample of residents in your area. Just hit the pause button and have a read through answer A and see what you make of it. Now, I think answer A highlights the kinds of problems that were talked about in the Chief Examiner's report that we saw on the previous slide. This seems to me to be a rehearsed answer. So there's lots of very good knowledge, quite detailed knowledge, of unstructured interviews in this paragraph, but if you hadn't seen this question, you would have no real idea what the purpose of this research was. So they haven't really linked the knowledge of unstructured interviews to the actual topic in the question. Whereas if you hit the pause button and read through this second answer, you'll see that again there's good knowledge of unstructured interviews, but in this instance it's much more closely related to the topic in the examination question. So answer B, I think, is a lot more effective than answer A because the knowledge is really closely linked to the purpose of the research, and that's what examiners are looking for. Okay, just a quick reminder about revision. You'll find all of the screencasts that you need to prepare for this section of the exam on my YouTube channel, and make sure that you work through all of those screencasts apart from the two that I've made on key studies. Okay, for the A2 exam, you need really good knowledge of all of the main methods, because the 10-mark question could be about any type of research method, but you don't need to use key studies. Okay, the 10-mark question, you're relating your knowledge of methods to the item, and then in the 30-mark question, you're talking about what you would do. So unlike the AS paper, you don't need to be referring to previous pieces of sociological research. And also remember, there are lots of really good resources on iLearn to help you prepare for this section of the exam, including all the past papers, links to all of the screencasts, key terms, and some other model answers for you to have a look at, so that you can see the type of effective exam technique that is required on this section of SY4. So I hope you found this screencast to be useful, and in the next screencast we'll be looking at effective exam technique on the World Sociology section of the SY4 paper, the second section.